Hello, this is Jen from Old Tinkerer Studio. Welcome to the second tutorial of the Blender Basics tutorial series. In this tutorial, we will be looking at modeling in Blender. A common object type used in the 3D scene is a mesh. Blender comes with a number of primitive mesh shapes. When you start Blender by default, you get this cube, which is a primitive mesh. Now let's learn how to add primitives to the scene. First, right-click on the cube and delete it by using the delete shortcut, the X key. If we want to add a primitive to the scene, we can do it by using the Create tab here in the toolbar. We have a number of mesh objects that we can add. We can get this same menu by hitting Shift-A on the screen. Make sure that your cursor is over the 3D viewport window when you hit Shift-A. There are 10 standard primitive shapes in Blender: plane, cube, circle, UV sphere, icosphere, cylinder, cone, torus, grid, and monkey, who is called Suzanne. In this case, we're going to be adding a cube. If you scroll down to the bottom of the toolbar, you will notice that we have various options for each mesh. The best and easiest way to start modeling in Blender is to simply start with a primitive mesh and then reshape it, add detail, and turn it into the model you want. In order to edit any object, including primitives, you will need to go into the Edit mode in Blender. By default, we are in the Object mode, where we can select the actual objects in the scene. If we want to make changes to the cube, we need to right-click on the cube to select it if it's not already selected, and then go into Edit mode by using the Tab key. Now let's take a look at how to actually reshape and edit objects in Blender. Let's right-click on the cube to select it if it isn't already selected, then delete it using the delete shortcut, the X key. Now let's add a simple sphere by using the shortcut Shift-A. If we want to edit the sphere, we need to right-click on the sphere to select it if it isn't already selected, and then hit the Tab key to go into Edit mode. The easiest thing to do is just to select the single vertex and move it around. So if we want to make sure that we're in vertex mode, we can hit Control-Tab and select vertex mode. You can use your scroll wheel to zoom in. If we right-click on a vertex, you will see that the manipulator comes up, and if we want to, we can move the manipulator, which in turn moves the vertex. We can also select multiple vertices. So if we shift right-click and select a couple vertices, they will still move along the normals. There are also a couple of ways we can select multiple vertices. One way to do this is to use the box or border tool using the shortcut of B left mouse button. You can also use the circle tool via the shortcut of C left mouse button. Another way to choose multiple vertices is to use the lasso tool via the shortcut of Control left mouse button. There is a potential problem with using these tools to select vertices. If you tumble around the back of the sphere, you will notice that you haven't selected the back-facing vertices. One way around this problem is to put the object into wireframe mode by hitting the Z key. That toggles between shaded and wireframe. Another way around this problem is using the X-ray mode. All you need to do is click on the limited selection button in the menu, and you will then be able to see all the vertices. We can do the same types of things with edges that we can with vertices. If we want to make sure that we're in edge mode, hit Control Tab and select Edge Mode. If I hold down the Shift key and Alt right click, I can select multiple edges. So if we wanted to, we can manipulate these edges. One thing that makes working in edge mode powerful is the ability to select edge loops. If we hit the Alt key and right click, we can actually select a whole ring of edges. It is a very quick way of selecting multiple edges. We can do the same types of things with faces that we can with vertices and edges. If we want to make sure that we're in face mode, hit Control Tab and select Faces. In addition to scaling, rotating, and moving faces, we can also shrink and fatten or push and pull. Using the Alt and right mouse button, select a row of faces on the top of the sphere. Then using Shift Alt, select the remaining rows of faces on the top of the sphere. When we get to the top of the sphere, we need to use the Circle tool. C left mouse button to select the remaining faces. Then simply use the right mouse button to lock in the selection. In the toolbar under the Tools tab, click on the Shrink Fatten button. When you move your mouse up and down in the 3D viewport, you can shrink or fatten the faces that we have selected. When we are satisfied with the modifications, left click and lock in the modifications. Now again, using Alt and your right mouse button, let's select the bottom rows of faces. Now in the toolbar under the Tools tab, we want to hit the Push and Pull button. And when we again move our mouse up and down in the 3D viewport, you can see that we are pushing and pulling the faces along the normals. When you're satisfied with the modifications, simply left click to lock in the modifications. Two other hotkeys which are useful when modeling are the More and Less options. If you select a vertex, edge, or face, you can easily select more or less based upon your selection. For example, if we select a face on the sphere and hit the Control numpad plus, you will expand the selection. And if we hit the Control numpad minus, we shrink the selection. Proportional editing allows us to edit more softly than simply selecting individual vertices, edges, or faces. If we select one vertex from the top of the sphere and begin moving it, you will notice that it has a sharp edge without any sort of fall off. This is a really inefficient way of modeling. This is where proportional editing comes in. We can turn proportional editing on and off either by using the button in the widget strip or by hitting the letter O. Hit the letter O to turn on proportional editing, then choose the topmost vertex and begin to move it. You can now see that we have gradual fall off rather than sharp edges. We can also change the amount of area that we are affecting. Choose the topmost vertex and then the G key. You will notice a circle surrounding the cursor. Scrolling up and down with the middle mouse button or using the page up and page down keys on the keyboard will allow us to change the amount of area that we affect. Once we have the circle the size we want, we just need to move the cursor. As we move the cursor, we can continue to resize the area. Once we have finished the modification, we just need to left click to lock in the modification. Sculpt Mode in Blender is a way to do more organic modeling. In order to sculpt a bit more easily and take advantage of the sculpting tools, it is best to have a dense model. In this demonstration, we will be using a simple cube that has been subdivided multiple times. Tab back into Object Mode and delete the sphere using the X key. Using Shift A, add a cube to the scene. With the cube selected, hit Tab to go into Edit Mode. And in the Tool shelf, you want to hit Subdivide under the Tools tab. Then change the number of cuts at the bottom of the panel to 20. This will give a more dense mesh to sculpt on. Now let's change to Sculpt Mode. When you're under Sculpt Mode, notice that the cursor changes to a brush-based cursor. Now all we need to do is choose a face on the cube and left click and drag. You'll see that I'm already sculpting. Let's undo this using Ctrl Z and explore the sculpting tools. At the top of the set of tools, we have various brushes that we can use in Sculpt Mode. The radius is how we control the size of a brush. Using this option, we can make our brush bigger or smaller. If we hold down the F key, we can also control the feather or fall off of the brush. Do this simply by moving the mouse up and down. We also have options for auto smooth and add and subtract. Add means that we can pull out vertices, whereas subtract means that we push the vertices in. We also have a number of other options in the Sculpt mode. We can paint using a texture, which is really handy for things like scales or even decorative items, such as those found on buildings. We can choose a stroke method, such as space or airbrush. Curve is basically affecting the feathering fall off of the brush. And Symmetry allows the mirroring of the sculpting along any axis. The Extrusion tool is one of the most important tools used in any 3D modeling program. We can extrude faces, edges, or vertices. Let's go back to Object Mode. And let's delete the standard cube using the X key and then delete. Now let's add a cylinder using the shortcut Shift-A. Now we can begin extruding portions of the cylinder. Let's start by extruding a face. Make sure the cylinder is selected and then hit the Tab key to go into Edit Mode. Once in Edit Mode, hit Ctrl Tab and go into Face Mode. Now choose one face with the right mouse button. In the tool shelf under the Add section, you will notice that we have two extrusion options: Extrude Region and Extrude Individual. If we only have a single face chosen, these two options work the same. So if we extrude a region and then move our mouse left and right, you will notice that it extrudes the singular face. When you left click, you lock in that extrusion. Let's use Ctrl Z to undo that extrusion and then the A key to deselect everything. When multiple faces, edges, or vertices are chosen, Extrude Region and Extrude Individual work differently. Let's Shift right click three separate faces. Now when we select Extrude Region, we see that the extrusion operates the same way it did with only a single face selected. Again, left clicking will lock the extrusion in place. Let's use Ctrl Z to undo that extrusion, and this time select Extrude Individual. Notice that the three faces are now extruding individually along their normals. Again, left clicking will lock that extrusion in place. Let's use Ctrl Z to undo that extrusion and the A key to deselect everything. Extruding also works on vertices. Hit Ctrl Tab and select Vertex Mode. Using Shift right click, choose three vertices on the cylinder. Then choose Extrude Region. This will simply create an edge that connects the object. Left clicking will lock that extrusion in place. Let's use Ctrl Z to undo the extrusion, and this time select Extrude Individual. Notice that the three vertices are now extruding individually along the normals. Again, left clicking will lock that extrusion in place. Let's use Ctrl Z to undo that extrusion and the A key to deselect everything. Extruding also works on edges. Hit Ctrl Tab and go into Edge Mode. Using Shift right click, choose three edges on the cylinder. Choose Extrude Region. This will simply create planes that connect to the object. Left clicking will lock that extrusion in place. Let's use Ctrl Z to undo that extrusion, and this time select Extrude Individual. Notice that there is no difference between this and Extrude Region. Again, left clicking will lock that extrusion in place. Let's use Ctrl Z to undo the extrusion and the A key to deselect everything. Now select the topmost edge loop by Alt right clicking on a single edge and choose Extrude Region. This will allow us to create extra geometry at the top of the cylinder. Left-clicking will lock that extrusion in place. Let's tab back into Object Mode and using the A key, deselect all the objects. Place your 3D cursor anywhere you want to add a mesh by using the left mouse button. Then using Shift A, add a UV sphere to the scene. You will notice that it looks like a series of flat planes and doesn't look smooth at all. Let's smooth the UV sphere. Make sure that you have the UV sphere selected by right-clicking and then tab into Edit Mode. In the tool shelf, click on the tab Shading UVs. This will access the shading options. Flat shading displays the faces as flat, whereas smooth shading displays the faces as smooth. Using Control Tab, make sure that you are in Face Select mode. Using Alt and the right mouse button, select a row of faces on the top half of the sphere. Then using Shift Alt, select the remaining rows. Once we get to the top, we will need to use our Circle Select to select the remaining portion of the sphere. Then right-click, and now we have the top half of the sphere selected. Then choose Smooth under the Faces section in the tool panel. Using the A key, deselect the faces, and then tumble around using your middle mouse button. You can clearly see the top half of the UV sphere is quite smooth compared to the lower half. Let's tab back into Object Mode and using the A key, deselect all the objects. Place your 3D cursor anywhere you want to add a mesh. Then using the shortcut Shift A, add a cube to the scene. If you look at the cube, you will notice that it has 6 flat faces. One way to add more detail to a mesh is to subdivide it. Let's subdivide the cube. Make sure that the cube is selected and then tab into Edit Mode. In the tool shelf, make sure to click on the Tools tab if it isn't already selected, and under Add, click on Subdivide. Now we see options come up at the bottom of the tool shelf. Note that once you click the mesh, the options at the bottom of the tool shelf will disappear. Notice that the cube is already subdivided and we now have 4 faces on each side. If we increase the number of cuts to 2, you will notice that we now have 6 faces on each side of the cube. You can increase or decrease the number of cuts by using the arrows or clicking inside the field and typing in a number and then hitting the Tab key. We can also smooth out the edges by using the smoothness option. If we change the smoothness to 0.5, notice that the cube is looking more spherical. Next, we have the quad corner type. We have the options of using fan, straight cut, path, or invert. Fractal randomizes the vertices, and along normal is used in conjunction with fractal. Subdividing meshes is a great way to improve our modeling for both organic and non-organic types of modeling. We have already seen how to select an object by right-clicking on it, be it a mesh or simply a face, edge, or vertex. We can also select objects in the outliner. If I wanted to select the lamp, for example, I would just click on Lamp in the outliner, and you will notice that now the lamp is selected. We can also select multiple objects by holding the Shift key and right-clicking. So if we wanted to also select a camera, all we need to do is hold down the Shift key and right-click on the camera. You will notice that both objects are highlighted on the 3D viewport and in the outliner. If we also select the cube by Shift right click, notice that the cube is highlighted in a darker, and in this case a different color. This shows us that the cube was the last object selected. Note that in the default settings, the selected objects will have an orange color. To deselect an object, we need to hold down the Shift key and select the objects. So let's deselect the cube and the camera by Shift right clicking on each object. A quick way to select everything in the scene is by using the A key. And if we want to deselect everything in the scene, we simply hit the A key again. There are two other main ways of selecting objects in Blender: the box or border select and the circle select. Let's tab back into object mode and add a UV sphere to the scene using the shortcut Shift A. Then tab back into edit mode. Use the A key to deselect everything. Once we hit the B key for box or border select, notice that we have crosshairs in the scene. All we need to do is left click and drag over the UV sphere to make a selection. If we hit B to make another selection, notice that the original selection remains selected also. Use the A key to deselect everything. If we hit the C key for circle select, notice that we get a circular brush in the scene. All we need to do is left click and drag over the UV sphere to make a selection. Once the selection is made, simply hit the escape key or right click to lock in the selection. If we hit the C key again and make another selection, we notice that the original selection remains selected. One nice thing about using the circle select is that you can change the size of the circle select by either rolling the middle mouse button or using the plus and minus on the keypad. This allows for greater flexibility when making a selection. Another handy selection tool is Inverse. If we hit Ctrl-I while we have some faces selected on the UV sphere, we will select all the other faces and deselect the original face selections. There are times when we need to move our objects around in 3D space. In order to do so, we need to know about the axes in Blender. If we look in the lower left-hand corner of the 3D viewport, you will notice an icon which shows the axes. The blue axis is the Z-axis, which is the vertical axis. The green axis is the Y-axis, and the red axis is the X-axis. The easiest way to move objects is with the Translate manipulator. Tab back into Object Mode and make sure the UV sphere is selected. If we want to quickly move the object along a specific axis, we can constrain the object to a particular axis by using the Transform gizmo. In order to move only along the X-axis, you need to grab the red arrow and move the object. To move along the Y-axis, grab the green arrow and move the object. And lastly, to move along the Z-axis, grab the blue arrow and move the object. Another way to move the UV sphere along specific axes is to use the G key. If we want to move only along the X-axis, we hit the G key and then the X key, and then move the object. Notice that it is now constrained to the X-axis. To move along the Y-axis, hit the G key and then the Y key, and move along the Y-axis. To move along the Z-axis, hit the G key and then the Z key, and move along the Z-axis. There are also times when we need to rotate our objects. The easiest way to rotate objects is with the Rotate manipulator. By using the Rotate manipulator, we can constrain the rotation to a specific axis. The red line constrains the rotation around the X-axis. The green line constrains the rotation around the Y-axis. And the blue line constrains the rotation around the Z-axis. Another way to rotate the UV sphere along specific axes is using the R key. If we want to rotate around the X-axis, we simply hit the R key and then the X key and rotate the object. Notice that it is now constrained to the X-axis. To rotate along the Y-axis only, hit the R key and then the Y key and rotate the object around the Y-axis. To rotate around the Z-axis only, hit the R key and the Z key and rotate the object around the Z-axis. We can also rotate objects in degrees. All we need to do is hit the R key and then one of the axes, X, Y, or Z, and then the number of degrees, for example 90, and then hit the Enter key. There are also times when we need to scale our objects. The easiest way to scale objects is with the Scale manipulator. By using the Scale manipulator, we can constrain the scale to a specific axis. The red line constrains the scale to the X-axis. The green line constrains the scale to the Y-axis. And the blue line constrains the scale to the Z-axis. Another way to scale the UV sphere along specific axes is to use the S key. If we want to scale only along the X-axis, we simply hit the S key and then the X key, and then scale the object. To scale along the Y-axis only, hit the S key and the Y key, and then scale the object along the Y-axis. To scale along the Z-axis only, hit the S key and then the Z key, and scale the object along the Z-axis. We can also scale objects numerically. All we have to do is hit the S key, and then the axis, X, Y, or Z, and then the number, for example 2, and hit Enter. An easy option in order to move objects precisely in Blender is to use Snap. First, let's delete the UV sphere. Add a cube to the scene using Shift A. Then tab into Edit Mode. The easiest way to snap objects is snap to grid. Choose the snap object and move the cube using the Translate manipulator. Notice that the cube snaps to the grid. We can also snap faces, edges, and vertices. Use the shortcut Control-Tab and enter Face Mode. Make sure Snap is activated and then choose Face from the Snap Element options. Right-click on the top face to choose it and then pull it straight down along the Z-axis. Notice that when you get close to the bottom face, it will snap to it and it becomes a plane. Now let's undo that snapping procedure with Ctrl Z. Use the shortcut Ctrl Tab and go into Edge Mode. Make sure that Snap is activated and choose Edge from the Snap element list. Right-click on the front edge to choose it, and then pull it straight along the Z-axis. Notice that when you get close to the back edge, the two edges snap together. Now let's undo that snapping procedure with Ctrl Z. Use the shortcut Ctrl Tab to go into vertex mode. Make sure that Snap is activated and then choose Vertex from the Snap element list. Right-click on the top front vertex to choose it, and then pull it straight back along the X-axis. Notice that when you get close to the back vertex, the two vertices snap together. Another option for snapping is to snap an object to the 3D cursor. Using the left mouse button, place the 3D cursor somewhere in the scene. Hit the A key to deselect everything, and then hit the A key a second time to select the entire cube. Use the shortcut Shift S, and then choose Selection to Cursor Offset. This will move the entire cube to the 3D cursor. Modifiers, as opposed to the basic editing tools we've been using so far, are a lot more interactive. So let's take a brief look at how modifiers help when modeling in Blender. Tab back into the object mode and delete the meshes. Now using Shift A, add a cube to the scene. Expand the Properties panel so you can see all the tabs. Click on the tab with the little wrench to access the Object Modifiers tab. If we click on the Add Modifier button, we will see a lot of modifiers. Right now we will just look at how modifiers work, so let's look at a simple modifier. Make sure your cube is selected, and under Deform, click on the Simple Deform modifier. Notice how the cube twists and deforms. Let's look at the options that are common to all modifiers. The first thing we see is the name of the modifier, in this case, Simple Deform. The first option with the camera icon turns the modifier on and off in the renderer. The second option with the eyeball turns the modifier on and off in the 3D viewport. The third modifier with the cube icon shows the modifier when you are in edit mode. The last option with the triangle icon is used in edit mode to change the cage around the modifier. Hit the tab key and go into edit mode. Notice there is a box around the cube. This is the cage. If we click on the triangle icon, the cage now conforms to the deformed cube mesh. Turn off the cage option by clicking on the triangle and then hitting tab to return to the object mode. The next two triangles next to the cage icon move individual modifiers up and down in the stack, and the X next to these triangles simply deletes the modifier. The Apply button applies the modifiers to the mesh. Once you have applied the modifier, you cannot continue to make changes to it, so only apply the modifier when you're done making changes to it. The Apply as Shape key allows us to apply this modifier as a shape key within the shape key stack. We will be going over shape keys in a later tutorial. We can also copy the modifier using the copy button. Now let's look at the options that are applicable to this modifier. We see that we have 4 different modes available: twist, which is the default, bend, taper, and stretch. For now, we will just leave the twist mode active. This modifier has a deform factor, which is the angle at which the mesh is deformed. The limits option allows us to change where the twist starts and stops. We also have the option of locking to the x-axis or the y-axis. Let's tab into Edit Mode and look at the other modes available to us. Turn on the Cage mode by clicking on the triangle icon. The Bend mode allows us to bend the mesh. The Taper mode allows us to taper the mesh. The Stretch mode allows us to stretch and squash the mesh. Let's say we want to have both a twist and a stretch on this cube. We can easily do this by adding a second simple deform modifier. We just go to Add Modifier. In the pull-down list, choose Simple Deform. Now what we need to do is change the mode of the top modifier to Stretch. Now we have 2 modifiers affecting the cube. If I wanted the twist mode to affect the cube first, all I need to do is switch the stacking order using the triangles. Now let's take a look at how to create text in Blender. Let's start with a fresh file. Go to File, New, Reload Startup File. We need the cube, so right-click to select it if it isn't already selected, and then hit the X key and delete. Now we can add some text using the shortcut Shift-A and Text. Since we want to edit this text, tab into Edit Mode. If we tumble around for a better view, we can see that we have a cursor placed at the end of the word. All we need to do is hit the backspace key and type whatever we wish. Let's expand the Properties panel so we can see all of the icons. Click on the icon that looks like an F. This will bring up the options for our text. Resolution is how Blender will treat the U direction of the text. The U direction refers to control points for NURB surfaces, which are similar to edge loops for meshes. Fill determines the way a curve is filled in when it is extruded and/or beveled. Under the Display option, you see an option for fast editing. When this box is checked, Blender does not fill polygons while editing the text. Texturing is used for adding a texture to the text. Geometry modification allows for altering the space between the letters. In other words, it thickens or thins the letters. Let's change the offset to 0.015 and hit Enter. And we can see that the letters have become thicker. We can also extrude the letters. If we change the extrude to 0.05 and hit the Enter key, and then tumble our view, we can see that we've added thickness to the letters. The Bevel option changes the size and resolution of the bevel. Let's change the depth to 0.015. And now you can see a slight bevel on the letters. Taper object allows us to make a letter get thinner towards the end, and Bevel object allows us to give a letter a custom bevel. We can also change the font. In order to do this, you will need to know where the fonts are located on your machine. For PCs, the fonts are located in the Windows folder under Fonts. For Macs, the fonts are located in the Library folder under Fonts. And for Linux, the fonts are located in the Library folder under Fonts. In order to change the font, click on the Font folder icon to the right of the regular, bold, italic, or bold and italic. Then locate the Fonts folder. Then choose the font that you want. And then click Open Font. We also have the option to change the size of the text or the sheer of the text. We can use an object font, which permits us to essentially make our own font within Blender, and we can place text on a curve. We can use bold, italic, underline, and small caps to change the look of the text. The paragraph section allows us to change the horizontal and vertical alignment of the text, as well as the spacing and the offset. The text box section allows us to distribute the text amongst rectangular areas within the single text object. Now let's take a look at how to use Booleans in Blender. Let's start with a fresh file, go to File, New, Reload Startup File. Go into orthographic mode, 5 on the numpad, and then go to Front View using the number 1 on the numpad. Now we need to add another mesh using the shortcut Shift A and adding a cylinder. Use the red arrow to move the cylinder along the x-axis so it sits beside the cube. Now shift right-click on the cube so it is selected along with the cylinder, and then hit Shift D and Enter to duplicate both meshes, and then move them to the side using the red arrow. Repeat this process one more time so that you have 3 cubes and 3 cylinders side by side. The Boolean modifier is used to cut away or add to another mesh. Select the first cylinder and move it so it intersects the first cube. Select the cube and go into the Modifiers panel. Add a Boolean modifier. In order for this to work, we need to select the object to be the effector. In this case, the cylinder. Under Object, choose Cylinder. Now if we go into wireframe mode, we can see that the cylinder has intersected with the cube. Now hit A to deselect everything. Select the second cylinder and move it so it intersects the second cube. Select the second cube and add a Boolean modifier. This time we are going to change the operation to union and select cylinder 001 under Object. Now we see that the cube and the cylinder have joined to form a new mesh. Now hit A to deselect everything. Select the third cylinder and move it above the third cube. Using the shortcut S, resize the cylinder so it's about half the size. Now move the cylinder so it intersects with the cube. Select the third cube, add a Boolean modifier. This time we are going to change the operation to difference and select cylinder 002 as the object. Once we hit apply and then move the cylinder, we can see that a hole is now cut into the cube. This concludes the Blender modeling tutorial. Next week we will learn about materials in Blender.